Deep Dive Podcast.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know, you sent over this academic paper, and it's got some pretty bold ideas about age-related diseases.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the author is arguing that they're not just like random wear and tear, but they're actually driven by these specific vicious cycles, is what they're calling them.
Interesting.
So I was hoping we could unpack this a bit,
Absolutely.
because I think this deep dive is going to take us right into the heart of biogerontology.
Sure, for sure.
It's all about, understanding the mechanisms of aging itself.
Right.
So you ready to get a little technical?
Absolutely. I'm always up for a challenge.
Okay, great. So what I found fascinating about this paper
Yeah.
was that it doesn't just list the causes of, diseases like
Right.
atherosclerosis, hypertension,
Yeah.
diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's.
Mhm.
It actually breaks down how these potential cycles work.
Right.
And that's what could offer clues about where we might intervene.
Yeah. I think that's a really fascinating approach. What's really interesting is that the author starts with this analysis of mortality data.
Oh, wow. So they're looking at like death rates and stuff.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to find the disease's fingerprints before they even dive into like the nitty-gritty biological mechanisms.
That's really interesting. So what did these mortality statistics reveal? What were the fingerprints?
Well, the author found that for many of these diseases, the death rates tend to rise exponentially with age.
Okay.
And that exponential increase, the author argues, really hints at this underlying positive feedback loop
Oh, I see.
that's driving each disease.
So it's like a fire
Yes,
that
exactly.
keeps growing as it consumes more fuel.
Exactly. It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
Okay, so this isn't saying that everyone is destined to get these diseases.
No, not at all.
It's more about like a pattern in how they progress over time.
Exactly. It's about understanding these underlying processes at play.
Right.
And it's worth noting that while the exponential function seems to fit many of these diseases, there are a couple, like essential hypertension and Parkinson's, where a logistic function actually provides a better match
Oh, interesting.
for the data.
Okay.
So that might suggest there are some limiting factors.
Gotcha. So it's not a one-size-fits-all model.
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, the paper then jumps into atherosclerosis.
Yes.
And let me warn you, it gets pretty detailed.
Buckle up.
Okay, so atherosclerosis, as most people probably know, is all about the buildup of plaque in our arteries.
Mm-hmm.
And this paper is really zeroing in on how that process might be a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly.
So let's try to walk through those steps. It all starts with LDL cholesterol, right?
It does. But the paper emphasizes that it's not just LDL cholesterol floating around in the blood.
Okay.
It's the oxidized LDL, or ox-LDL.
Ah,
That's the real troublemaker here.
okay.
And interestingly, while blood LDL levels remain pretty stable with age,
Ah.
it's the ox-LDL that seems to accumulate in the artery wall.
So this oxidized LDL is what kicks off the whole vicious cycle.
Yeah. Think of it this way. Ox-LDL is like a distress signal in the artery wall.
Okay.
It attracts these white blood cells called monocytes,
Ah.
which are kind of like the immune system's first responders. And then these monocytes morph into macrophages,
Okay.
and their job is to clean up the mess.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah.
Sounds like a normal immune response.
Right.
So where does the cycle come in? Where does it go wrong?
Well, the problem is that while these macrophages are trying to break down this ox-LDL, they release these reactive oxygen species, which are like little chemical firecrackers going off in the artery wall.
So I see where this is going. More damage, more inflammation.
Exactly. And these ROS, they don't just damage the surrounding tissue, they also further oxidize more LDL, creating even more ox-LDL.
So it's like calling in more firefighters
Yeah.
who then accidentally start more fires?
It's a perfect analogy. It's a self-amplifying loop.
More ox-LDL,
Yeah.
more macrophages,
Yeah.
more ROS, even more ox-LDL. Now, the paper also mentions this thing called fibrous cap thinning.
Yes.
How does that fit into all of this?
So the fibrous cap is basically a protective layer over the plaque.
Okay,
You can think of it like a lid on a boiling pot.
gotcha.
And as this vicious cycle keeps going, the plaque grows, it puts pressure on this cap, making it thinner and more likely to rupture.
Oh, no.
And to make matters worse, the macrophages actually release substances that weaken the cap as well.
It's like the body is sabotaging its own repair mechanisms.
It's really quite remarkable.
Wow, this paper is making me look at heart disease in a whole new light.
I think that's one of the things that's so compelling about this paper.
Yeah. Now, what about hypertension?
Yes.
The paper suggests there might be two different cycles at play there.
That's right. They focus on the two main ways that blood pressure can go up.
Okay.
increased mean arterial pressure
Yep.
and increased pulse pressure.
Gotcha.
And by analyzing mortality data, the author noticed these distinct patterns,
Oh, interesting.
for each suggesting different underlying mechanisms might be at work.
So let's start with mean arterial pressure. What's happening there?
So this cycle really centers around a molecule called nitric oxide, or NO,
Okay, I've heard of that.
which is essential for blood vessel relaxation.
Right.
So when NO levels drop, blood vessels constrict and pressure rises.
Makes sense. But what's really interesting is the paper suggests that low salt intake,
Oh, yeah.
which we usually think of as healthy,
Right.
can actually kickstart this cycle.
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Totally. How does low salt lead to high blood pressure?
Well, the paper explains that low salt intake can activate a system that
Yeah.
ultimately leads to the production of, you guessed it, reactive oxygen species.
Oh, no, not the ROS again.
Yeah.
I thought those were mainly a problem in atherosclerosis.
It seems like they're a common thread in a lot of these vicious cycles.
Okay.
In this case, they react with NO reducing its availability and leading to vasoconstriction.
So less NO means tighter blood vessels
Right.
and higher pressure. Now, the paper also mentions this thing called eNOS, which is an enzyme that I guess normally produces NO.
It does.
So how does that factor into the cycle?
Well, so eNOS needs a cofactor called BH4 to function properly
Got
to
it.
produce NO.
Mm-hmm.
But when BH4 is oxidized by, you guessed it, ROS,
The ROS again?
eNOS can actually switch to producing superoxide.
No way. So instead of making the good guy, it starts churning out more of the bad guy.
It's like a double betrayal.
That's wild.
And the paper argues that this can lead to long-term structural changes in the blood vessels, making it even harder to reverse the hypertension.
Okay, my head is spinning a little bit with all this biochemistry.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Let's switch gears to pulse pressure.
Okay.
The paper suggests that this is more about the mechanics of our arteries.
Yes, think of it this way. Pulse pressure is basically the difference between the top number and the bottom number when you get your blood pressure checked.
Oh, right. Systolic and diastolic.
Exactly. And as we age, our arteries naturally stiffen. They lose their elasticity.
So they can't absorb the pressure changes from the heartbeat as effectively.
Precisely. And this leads to a wider gap between systolic and diastolic pressure,
Oh, I see.
hence higher pulse pressure.
Okay.
What's concerning is that the paper suggests hypertension itself might actually worsen this stiffening,
Oh, no.
creating yet another vicious cycle.
It's like a domino effect of negative consequences.
Right.
It seems like the takeaway here is that these diseases aren't just like simple malfunctions.
Yeah.
They're these complex, interconnected processes.
Yeah, that's what the paper is getting at.
Yeah.
These aren't isolated incidents,
Mm-hmm.
but rather potential cascading failures within the body.
Wow. Well, we've covered a lot of ground already,
We have.
and it's clear that these vicious cycles are not for the faint of heart.
They're quite complex.
Yeah. But I'm ready to dive even deeper into the world of diabetes, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's.
Okay.
So what do you say we take a little pause here? And then we'll pick up the conversation with those diseases in the next part.
All right, let's do it.
Sounds good.
Deep Dive Podcast.
Welcome back. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of these vicious cycles.
No, right? It's amazing.
Yeah. And there's a lot more to uncover.
Mhm.
So let's shift our focus now to diabetes.
Right, diabetes.
Yeah.
Another big one on the list of age-related diseases.
Absolutely a major player. Okay, so let's dive into type 2 diabetes then. What's the vicious cycle all about there?
So in type 2 diabetes, the problem starts with insulin resistance.
Okay.
Your body's cells become less responsive to insulin, which
Wow.
is the hormone that helps regulate blood sugar.
Right.
And this forces the pancreas to work overtime, pumping out more and more insulin
Oh, wow.
to try and keep those blood sugar levels in check.
So the pancreas is like this tired factory worker
Yeah.
trying to keep up with an ever-increasing demand.
A great analogy.
Yeah.
But here's where the cycle kicks in. This constant overwork
Mm-hmm.
takes a toll on the beta cells.
Mm-hmm.
They start to malfunction and even die off.
Oh, no.
And as the number of beta cells dwindles,
Right.
the body's ability to produce insulin declines further.
So it just gets worse and worse.
It exacerbates the problem.
Yeah.
It's a downward spiral.
Less insulin,
Right.
higher blood sugar,
Right.
more stress on the remaining beta cells.
Leading to even more beta cell death.
It's like the body is working against itself.
It's really quite remarkable. And the paper points out another interesting detail.
Okay.
As these beta cells die off,
Uh-huh.
the ratio of beta cells to alpha cells in the pancreas changes.
Okay.
And alpha cells produce glucagon,
Uh-huh.
which has the opposite effect of insulin. It raises blood sugar level.
Oh, wow. So it just makes the problem even worse.
So this shift in the ratio further contributes to that problem of high blood sugar.
It's crazy. So
Yeah.
much for that whole, like, wisdom of the body idea.
Right. It certainly challenges that notion.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
This paper has a very interesting take on amyloid plaques, how they actually form. It's a little different than what we usually hear.
Yeah, so they highlight these mutations. In amyloid precursor protein, or presenilin-1, which is involved in processing amyloid precursor protein. And these mutations are like the only ones we know of that actually directly cause early onset familial Alzheimer's disease. And they basically cause the body to make too much of this longer, stickier form of amyloid beta, called amyloid beta 42, and that clumps together more easily.
Okay, so we've got these abnormal clumps of amyloid beta 42. But how does that, like, turn into this runaway process?
Well, the paper suggests that amyloid beta 42 acts kind of like a prion,
Yeah.
where a misfolded protein can actually cause other normal proteins to misfold as well. So these amyloid beta 42 oligomers, the ones that form because of the mutations, they're like seeds. They make more and more amyloid beta misfold and clump up. And that creates this like self-perpetuating cycle, leads to those amyloid plaques we see in Alzheimer's.
So it's not just that amyloid beta is there. It's like this chain reaction of misfolding that really drives the disease.
Yeah, that's a key point. And it gets even more interesting because the paper suggests that this amyloid beta cycle could actually trigger another vicious cycle with tau protein this time.
Tau protein, right, that's the other big one in Alzheimer's. So how does tau get involved in all this?
Well, research shows that amyloid beta 42 can actually encourage the formation of these abnormal tau aggregates, which lead to neurofibrillary tangles, and those mess up how neurons work. And on top of that, those abnormal tau aggregates, they can also trigger normal tau proteins to misfold, creating another one of those self-sustaining cycles.
Wow, so it's like a double whammy.
Yeah,
Amyloid beta starts it all off, and then tau just makes it worse.
exactly. And the paper argues that's what might be behind the complex way Alzheimer's progresses. And it definitely makes you question the amyloid hypothesis and the treatments we have now that focus on just reducing amyloid beta.
Yeah, for sure makes you think twice about how we treat it, especially when it's already progressed.
Exactly. The paper implies that just targeting one of these cycles might not be enough. Therapies might need to address both amyloid beta and tau if they're going to really work.
That's something for the researchers to think about. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about another big neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's. The paper draws some interesting parallels between the role of amyloid beta in Alzheimer's and alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's.
Yeah, they point out that similar to those mutations we talked about in amyloid precursor protein and presenilin-1 in Alzheimer's, the only mutations we know of that cause familial early onset Parkinson's are in the gene that codes for alpha-synuclein. And these mutations, or even just having more of the normal alpha-synuclein protein, can lead to these toxic clumps forming, just like with amyloid beta.
So is this another case of a single mutation setting off this whole cascade of protein misfolding?
Yeah, that's what they're suggesting. And they think it could all start in a very specific type of cell, a neural progenitor cell, in a brain region where there's still neurogenesis happening, like the olfactory bulb. And this progenitor cell, the one with the mutated or duplicated alpha-synuclein gene, it moves to the striatum. That's a brain region connected to the substantia nigra, where those dopamine-producing neurons die off in Parkinson's. And that could explain why it's the dopaminergic neurons that are so vulnerable in this disease.
So they're saying that the alpha-synuclein aggregates are what actually cause the neurons to die in Parkinson's.
That's one of their main points, yeah. And it goes even further. They suggest there might be 2 more vicious cycles that contribute to Parkinson's progression on top of that.
2 more. Tell me more.
So the first one involves the proteasome system. That's basically the cell's garbage disposal for proteins. The paper suggests that as those alpha-synuclein oligomers build up, they start to clog up the proteasome system. And that leads to all sorts of misfolded proteins and protein fragments building up, including these truncated forms of alpha-synuclein. And those are even more likely to clump together.
Oh, wow. So not only are the toxic proteins building up, but the cell's ability to get rid of them is getting messed up too.
Exactly. And the second cycle involves mitochondria. Those are the powerhouses of our cells. The paper says that as those alpha-synuclein oligomers accumulate, they can damage mitochondria.
So they're attacking the cell's energy source.
Yeah, and this mitochondrial dysfunction leads to more reactive oxygen species being produced, and those can actually modify and damage alpha-synuclein even more, making it more prone to aggregating. It's this vicious cycle that keeps making things worse and speeding up the progression of the disease.
So this is a lot to take in. Are we saying Parkinson's is driven by not one, but three different vicious cycles all intertwined?
That's the hypothesis they're putting forward. And they really emphasize that all this complexity means we need a multi-pronged approach to treatment. Targeting just one cycle probably won't cut it. We need therapies that can address all these different aspects of these vicious cycles.
This is all incredibly fascinating. But I can already sense that some of our listeners might be feeling a bit overwhelmed at this point.
Yeah, it's a lot, but I think the big takeaway is that we need to move past that simple wear and tear idea of aging, We have to look at the complexity of how these processes connect with each other.
It's not just time passing. It's these active processes, like feeding into themselves and pushing the disease forward.
Right, and understanding the cycles isn't just some theoretical thing. It has big implications for how we treat these diseases and maybe even how we prevent them.
So let's talk about that. What are the practical implications of this vicious cycle theory for longevity research?
Well, the paper says it could open up totally new ways to treat these diseases. Like, instead of just trying to reduce amyloid beta or alpha-synuclein, which has been really hard to do, we could focus on actually disrupting those mechanisms that cause them to clump together and spread.
So more like breaking the cycle, not just masking the symptoms.
Exactly. They suggest we target those early stages of the cycle, like stop those first toxic oligomers from forming, or block them from making other proteins misfold too. We could even find ways to help the cell's own defenses against those misfolded proteins, like boost the proteasome system or develop therapies that go after those truncated forms of alpha-synuclein.
So this vicious cycle idea is giving researchers a whole new set of tools to work with.
Yeah, it is. And they even suggest that this principle might go beyond specific diseases they talk about. Maybe it applies to aging itself.
That's really interesting. Are they saying that aging itself might be driven by these kinds of vicious cycles?
Well, they don't go too deep into it, but they do bring up the idea that some of the hallmarks of aging, like chronic inflammation and cellular senescence, might work through similar self-amplifying loops.
So it's not just individual diseases, but maybe the whole aging process itself that's subject to these runaway cycles.
That's something more research needs to look into, but it's a pretty amazing idea, right? Could change how we think about aging and longevity entirely.
But this is all super exciting for longevity research. But what about for society as a whole? How does this new way of thinking about aging change how we understand healthcare and how we deal with an aging population?
Well, one big thing is it could shift our focus from treatment to prevention. If we can figure out what triggers those vicious cycles and understand those early stages, we might be able to intervene before any serious damage happens.
So early detection and intervention become even more important.
Absolutely, and that would have a huge impact on healthcare systems and how we use resources. Imagine if we could identify people who are at risk for these diseases early on. We could start taking preventative measures right away, maybe delay or even stop the disease from developing altogether.
That would be huge, not just for individuals, but for everyone.
For sure. It would change how we approach healthcare for older people, not just reacting to disease, but being proactive and focusing on keeping people healthy for longer.
It would probably take a change in how we think about things too, both from individuals and from doctors.
You're right. We'd need to put more emphasis on personalized medicine, lifestyle changes, and really understanding how our genes, our environment, and aging all interact.
This vicious cycle theory is really opening up a lot of possibilities, but also a lot of challenges.
It is, and there's still so much we don't know, but I think this new way of looking at things has the potential to revolutionize how we understand aging and age-related diseases. Maybe it'll help us figure out how to live not just longer, but healthier, more fulfilling lives.
That's a great note to end on. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and for helping us understand all this.
Happy to be here.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into aging research. We hope you learned something new about the vicious cycle theory and what it might mean for the future of longevity. Until next time, keep those questions coming and stay curious.
Deep Dive Podcast.